In this tutorial, we'll be using Spring Boot with Kotlin and Angular and Ionic to build a full stack mobile and PWA application. So we'll be able to deploy this to Android and iOS, as well as on the web. So in this tutorial, we'll be going over how to add to-dos, delete them when they're no longer necessary, or modify their status. In this tutorial, I want to make sure that there's a disclaimer before you start taking it. You should already know how to set up a database, so that will not be taught in this course because you're expected to understand how to build a database and also a lot of the basic concepts of a REST API, because this is a very fast course. So a lot of these tools you're going to already need to know, and this is going to be more project-based. So make sure that you have a full understanding of these tools before you start this tutorial. We'll want to install the OpenJDK locally on our computer to run Java projects. So one of the easiest ways to do this is using adopt JDK. You can find this at adoptjdk.net. And I like to use long-term stability versions. These are very stable and aren't most likely to change, and they're also supported for several years. So we'll use version 11, and in the future this might be bumped up to version 16, but for now we'll be using version 11, and we'll choose our JVM, our Java Virtual Machine. I just stick with the first option, and I download it. You'll have a downloader. This may take a few minutes. Because I already have this downloaded, I will cancel this. And I will go here, and I'll see that Java is installed. I'll do Java -- version, and I'll see that I have the OpenJDK 11 installed on my computer. In this tutorial, we're going to be using JetBrains IDE, just because it's an easier tool to use for Java development than Visual Studio Code. So when it comes to Java and Kotlin development, I tend to stick with IntelliJ. You can get this by downloading it. You can purchase a monthly or yearly subscription, which is not required because you can do the free trial. You can use the early access program. But for this course, this is the IDE we'll be using because there's a lot of database tools that don't come with other IDEs. Now, you can do some of the same stuff with Visual Studio Code, but you have to do it manually. And typically when you're on the job, companies want you to do things fast and get it done right. And sometimes it's not worth trying to do everything manually and making a mistake. You want to make sure that your whole workflow is progressing the application as fast as possible so you can get it out to your clients. And I would recommend IntelliJ. Now, this is not a sponsorship. I don't make anything by using this. This is just a tool that I've been using as a Java developer, and it just makes things so much easier. Like, things that would take me 30 minutes, I can do it within a couple minutes, and that's the key point. Just getting things out there and getting things up and running and not having to configure things every single time, which really saves a lot of developers a headache. And as a developer, you want to save time in order to get the app out as soon as possible and make sure that it works properly. So I would recommend getting this application. You can do the early access program, which is a great program. And in exchange for sending bug reports, you get to use their IDE, which is awesome. So in order to start using Spring Boot with Kotlin, we're going to have our Spring initializer. So let's create an application called to-do, and let's put this in the to-do folder. We're going to have our language set to Kotlin, and we're going to have Gradle. We're not going to use Maven because I typically find the XML files to be very difficult to read. Some people like them, but they're very old school. Gradle is more like a Java-esque or JavaScript-esque language. It's really easy to read. You don't have to worry about opening and closing tags and stuff like that. A lot of things can be done through one-liners. It's amazing. And here we're going to do com.codebrains. We're going to have our artifact to do, our package name, com.codebrains.todo. and we're going to have our project SDK. I have the Adopt Open JDK 11. You can download different versions, but I'm using version 11. So that's the version of Java I'm running on my computer. I have Java 11, and my packaging is a jar. So the next thing I want to do is in the web dependencies. Let's see what version of Spring Boot that I'll be using. I'll actually just be using 2.5.5. It's stable. I'll use Spring Web. That's a good one. And for SQL, I'll be using Spring Data JPA. I'll also be using Flyaway migrations. And I'll also be using the Postgres SQL driver. So these are the tools that I'll be using. Let's see. Are there any other dependencies that I would need? So let's check here one last time. Web, JPA, Flyaway, and Postgres. So there shouldn't be anything else that we need. And we can hit finish. And let's terminate this. So it will build our project. We have our Flyaway migrations. It's currently building the project folder out. One last thing, let's just make sure in our settings and our plugins, we have JPA Buddy. This is very important. We'll be using this very heavily in this project, so make sure that if you don't have it already, you have JPA Buddy. Awesome, so we've created our project. Everything seems to be running fine. Let's look through our source directory. We have our Kotlin folder and so on. Perfect. Let's start off by setting up our database configuration. So with our database, we'll go to main, resources. We'll see that there's a DB migrations folder, and we'll create those migrations later. But for now, what we'll do is Spring data source. Let's see, URL. You won't set that URL right now. We'll do spring.data source. Username, we'll set this to Postgres. Spring.data source. And set this to password. Password will be CodeBrains, Spring.data source. We'll set this to Postgres. Next, what we'll do is our database connections. Create a new database connection. And let's set this to PostgreSQL. Let's say localhost. This is my port number, but it might not be the one that you're using. So what's the name of this database? We'll set this to Kotlin to do. Make sure that's the one that I have set up here. Kotlin to do. And Postgres. Let me test this connection. Okay, it works. So I know that this URL works. And what I'll do is in my application properties, I'll paste that there. So my Spring data source URL. Also, I want to set my server.port. Port, and I'll set this to 8081. I'll save this. I can now see my database over here, and I'm connected, which is great. Let's start by adding some entities. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new package name, and let's call this entities. Awesome. So now that we have that, we're going to create an entities of to do. Let's go here, new JPA entity, and this is a project. This is a Kotlin file, and we'll choose the language of Kotlin. Do to do entity type. All right, awesome. I'll turn this off. So this is an open class. Now I ran into some issues in the past, so I tend to get rid of this. Let's add an ID. Let's change the strategy to identity. Awesome. And I'm not going to make this open, just because sometimes people run into issues with this. So let's add another basic type. Let's call this a title. It's going to be string. Get rid of this open again. And let's say another basic type of, I'll say completed. Completed. And don't make this a string. You want to make this boolean. So, and change this to false. You want the default to be false. And remove this. Okay. Save. Awesome. Now we're going to want to come down here and create. Actually, let's do this. Let's create a repository first. So JPA repository to do repository, and we have a class. So we have our interface, and we're good to go. Now we'll also want to create a migration. So we'll do a diff version migration, and we'll have our model as well as our DB. So this is the DB connection that we set up previously, and we'll create that. This may take a few seconds. So it creates a to-do table where you have your ID, title, completed, so on. This is awesome. So we'll save that. Awesome. Now that we have our entities and our migrations, we'll actually create a controller. So let's create a new package. Let's see here, package, controllers, and we'll create a new Kotlin class. Let's name this to-do controller. One of the first things we'll want to do is add Rust controller. Let's also add request mapping. Let's set this to to-dos. Now, one thing we'll want to do is allow for us to access our to-do repository. So let's say val to-do repository, and do repository. And let's say this is a to-do repository. Also, what we'll want to do is test out creating our to-dos. So let's create a post mapping. And let's say we'll have a function new to-do. And we'll have a request body to-do to-do. We'll return a to-do. And let's see. Return to-do repository. Save. And we'll have the to-do. Let's save this and test this out. Go to our Gradle commands, application, boot run. The initial build might take a while. All right, let's go to Insomnia and go to our Kotlin API. Let's say add to-do, and we've created a to-do. If we go to Postgres here, and let's go to schemas, public, our tables, you have our to-do table, awesome. Let's create a couple more to-dos. Add another to-do has an ID of 2, and add third to-do. Awesome, so we've created 3 to-dos now. So we've tested it, and things look to be working fine. Now that we can add our to-dos, let's actually start off by getting our to-dos. Let's stop this, and let's create a git mapping. Git mapping, and we'll have a function. Let's call it get to-dos. We'll do to-do repository, find all. Now that's a one-liner. Now, another thing that we'll do is, and let's actually see what this is. Perfect. Declare as type effort. We actually won't worry about this. Let's do another git mapping. And let's say to do ID. We'll do function get to do. We'll have our path variable. This path variable will be also to do ID. And let's see, we'll have to do ID and have it as type log. We'll also have optional to do. And let's see what the issue is here. We want to return our to-do by doing find by ID and to-do ID. Let's save this. So we have both get mappings for getting all of our to-dos and getting the to-do by ID. Let's run this in Gradle with boot run. We'll go back to Insomnia. Let's get all of these to-dos. Awesome. And let's try to get one by its ID. Let's get another one by its ID. All right, works perfectly fine. Now that we can get all of our to-dos, let's see if we can update our to-dos based on its ID. So let's have a put mapping. So let's do put mapping, and we'll say to do ID, and we'll name this function update to do. This function will take a path variable and let's say to do ID. Our to do ID will be of type long. We'll also want to take in a request body of our updated to do, and this will also be of that type to do. So the next thing we're going to do is get the to do. So get the old to do. Find by ID or null. If old to do equals null, we'll just return the old to do. Otherwise, we'll do return to do repository dot save updated to do. So let's save this and run. Let's update. So we've now modified this, and we've set this to true, and we've set a duplicate. Add a to do, add to do. So in the next video, we'll talk about actually deleting these to-dos. Now that we can update our to-dos, say for instance we make a mistake, we no longer need a to-do, we can delete it. So let's go here and create a new function. we'll create a delete mapping. This delete mapping will take the to-do ID and let's say function delete to-do, and all we need is the path variable, and let's have that as a to-do ID. And have that to-do ID as long. Because we've done this so many times, IntelliJ recognizes exactly what we want to do. Now we'll do a to-do repository dot delete by ID. And we have the to-do ID that we've passed in there. Save that. Run this. And once this is finished building, we should be able to delete our to-dos. Go here, delete a to-do. Go by all of our to-dos. Boom, there we go. Awesome. So now that we're finished with our API, we can focus on building the front end of this. So see you in the next video. To get started with this project, one of the first things that we'll be doing is installing the Ionic CLI. Let's go to Docs and Installation, and it'll ask you to install the CLI. You can do this by running npm install global Ionic CLI. Now, I already have Ionic installed, so this will take a few minutes, but make sure that you run this command first before you run any other commands in this tutorial. Now, if it is installed, you can actually run something called Ionic start. So if you go to your terminal and you're in a directory that you intend to use, do Ionic start, and use the app creation wizard. No. Make sure that you set this to no. And you'll choose your framework. In this tutorial, we'll be using Angular. And the project name, let's say Angular Ionic. Next, what we'll do is we're not going to do, okay, we have tabs, we have the side menu, blank, and list. This is the one that we'll start off with. So a list project. List. This will take a while to run the npm install. So just wait for everything to be installed first. Now that we have our project generated, we can cd into the project. And let's open it in Visual Studio Code. Let's check out the structure of the project. It's a typical Angular project. Let's look at source code. Let's look at the app structure, including the app modules file, the app component HTML file, as well as the routing file. We'll also see that we have multiple components: the home, message, services, and view message. So this is the template for our project. Now, if we want to run this, let's do Ionic serve, and it will build and run the project. This may take a few minutes, and it's going to work on port 8100. Let's check this out. While that is building, let's look at a few more components. Awesome. Let's look at our services file. This is a typical Angular service that's injectable. We use the provider of root. That way it's globally accessible through our application. Now, if we look here, it's running on this port number and it opened in our browser. We can click through this application. We see inbox, we see messages from people. If we click in here, then we'll have information from that message. Now, what we're going to do is get rid of a lot of these components and just make a basic to-do list. Before we get started, let's actually install a few dependencies. So let's look up capacitor HTTP. So this package is going to allow for us to make HTTP requests in our application. It's under the capacitor community. It's a fairly decent package to use. It's very easy, and you don't have to worry about a lot of the issues that come with making HTTP requests in Ionic. So before we even run this command, we're going to have to run another command. We're going to run Ionic build. This is going to create a www folder, and this is actually required before you even start adding any of these capacitors components. So this is going to create a build for us. Once the initial build finishes, let's copy and paste this, the npm install command for capacitor HTTP. And also we will sync it. This should take a few minutes. And while it is taking a few minutes, let's go over a few things. So the usage is fairly simple. You have the HTTP command, and you have the method for whatever request that you want to create, whether it's a GET request, post, delete, put. And you have the options, which include things like the URL, headers, parameters, but also it can contain data as well. Let's sync this. Awesome. Now in the next video, we'll start creating our service. Let's start off by creating a to-do service. So one of the first things that we'll do is go to our services folder and create a new file. Let's say to-do.service.ts. Awesome. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to import injectable from Angular core, and we're also going to import HTTP as well as HTTP response. Let's create our service, injectable. We'll have the provided in as root. What this does is it just gives us access to this globally throughout the application. We'll do export class to do service. Awesome. Now, let's change this to single quotes. Now, because we'll be getting to-dos, let's create an interface for those to-dos. Export interface to-do. This is just basically a contract that each of these to-dos has to abide by. The ID is potentially nullable. The reason why is sometimes if we're creating an ID, it's not going to have an ID when we create it, and we just wait for our service, our database, our REST API to create. So completed will be Boolean. So let's look at this again. We have our ID, our title, and completed. Next, what we'll do is let's have a private resource URL. And this URL will just be the base URL for your REST endpoint. Now, I changed my service to localhost 8000, but this can literally be anything. So whatever your API is using, change it to that port number or that URL. So for those that have watched the REST API portion of this course, after that, I've changed it to port 8000. So you can keep it at whatever port you're running, but just to make things a little bit easier for me, I changed it to port 8000. So there's our service. And this is injectable. In the next few videos, we're going to go over creating the different methods in this service, such as create, read, update, and delete, as well as how we're going to use this in different services. So I want to talk about creating and updating a to-do first, because you can't find to-dos until you've created them. And because updating is very similar to creating, we'll have that as well. So let's start off by doing create. And what we're going to do is pass in a to-do object. And we're going to return a promise of HTTP response. So for those that are familiar with JavaScript and TypeScript, this is the response that I'm returning. This is the parameter to actually run this method. And now we'll be creating the options for our request. Const options. This is just an object. We have URL. And our URL will be this dot resource URL. This is where we'll be making our requests. The data that we'll be sending is a to-do. And let's have headers. Let's say content type, and we'll have application/JSON. So this needs to be Spring. Let me exit out of this. A parsing problem. Now, this is a really weird naming convention. So what I'll just do is do ESLint to get rid of that. And return HTTP. And I'll say post. And I'll place in my options. So let's go over this again. We have our URL, our data, and our headers. Now let's have the update function. Update is very similar. We'll have to do and a promise of HTTP response. Let's have our options. But this time, we'll actually have an ID. So let's have the to-do.id. Then what we'll do is we'll return HTTP, and we'll do a put request. This put request is just a request that's used to update a resource in your API. Awesome. So we have our create and update methods. Now that we have our services for creating and updating a to-do, let's create the functions or methods for finding these to-dos. So let's do one called find all, and we'll also return a promise of HTTP response. Let's do const options. We can pull this from here. We're not going to be pulling in data, or we're not going to be adding any data. And from here, all we have to do is return HTTP, get, and place in those options. Now, say for instance, I just wanted to find one of these resources by itself. I could do find and say ID and set it to a number. Then what I would do is I would pass in the ID. So we have both of our functions, find all and then find, and getting it by its ID. So in this video, we'll be creating our last request, which is a delete request. We'll have delete, and we will pass in our ID. Let's do a promise. And like always, we return a HTTP response. Now, let's pass in these same options and return HTTP, DEL, and have those options. If you look here, then it says that this is a delete request. Awesome. That's fairly simple. Now, in the next few videos, we'll start building out our actual UI for this application. Before we start diving into our UI, I want to examine the home component. So let's go to our modules file, and we see we have forms, we have the routers that we'll be using, home router, and we also have our page file. So this acts just like a component, so don't be alarmed if you see page or component. It just depends on how you're using it. We have a service for getting our messages. We'll get rid of that, and we'll replace that with our service for getting our to-dos. Let's look at some of our HTML. We have a list of our messages. This will be replaced with to-dos. And we have an event for refreshing data. Let's take a look at our router. We have home routes and our message ID. We'll get rid of those and just keep the home and the to-dos route. So awesome. Let's start off by creating two new folders. The first one will be, let's see, to do. Awesome. I don't think we really need anything more than that for now. I was thinking about creating a view specifically for other stuff, but I think for now we should just have a to-do. Now, let's see. And in our home component, let's go over this one more time. Let's change this to CodeBrains to-dos and CodeBrains to-dos. You can see that this is in an Ion tab bar, and the title is going to be CodeBrains. If you're not familiar with any of the components, definitely head over to the documentation. You can see a ton of this and all of the components that we'll be using in the documentation. In each video, we'll go over some new components as well. Awesome. So in the next video, we'll start creating a to-do list. Let's start by creating a form component. So we're not going to create a separate component for this. We're going to place this inside of our home component because it's going to be visible all the time. Let's look at certain things like our buttons. So let's do a search. And we have Ion button. This is what the buttons look like on both iOS and Android. And it has various different properties. If we go to the Angular code, then we can check this out here. This is what an Ion button looks like. Cool. And just to make sure, I'll make sure always keep the documentation as Angular. Because we'll be submitting a form, let's go to the modules. Even though we have form module, I actually am going to be using a reactive form. So reactive forms module. There we go. Let's see. Now let's go over to our page file. We have refresh and we have get messages. So let's think this out a little bit. So when we refresh, we want to get to-dos, but also on our initial page load, we want to get to-dos. So we think about how would we do this. First, let's create a few variables. Let's say to-dos, and let's do to-do. We'll import that and have an array of to-dos. This array is initially empty. We'll also have a validate form and form group. Awesome. The next thing we want is a form builder. So let's say private FB and say form builder. Let's check and we'll import this. The next thing we'll do is a private and let's say to do service, and we'll import to do service. Save that. Also, let's make sure that we're running our application so we can see some of these changes. Now, let's say, for instance, we do a ng on init. We're going to implement. Let's go here. Implements on init. Let's add our ng on init method. As you know, this has the characteristics of void, the return value of void. This dot validate form equals this. This is a form builder dot group and let's say title. Null validators dot required. Awesome. Now let's go into the HTML a little bit. Okay. So let's talk about something. Let's talk about grids. So if we go back here, we can partition our screen using grids. We have ion grid, ion row, ion column. Now, what I'm going to do is say this. Let me go to in between the header and my list, ion dash grid. So I have my grid, and let me just give this a class and say ion grid. And I'm going to, let's just check to make sure nothing's broken. I'm going to say form and let's say form group equals validate form. Next, we'll have a method for submitting, but for right now, we'll leave that for the next video. Let's just create our UI. I'll say ion row. And I'll have a column. I'll have two columns actually. Ion say ion column. Create two of these. Now, what we're going to do is going to modify the size. So let's say size equals 9. And the size of this one will be 3. Size is equal to 12. So make sure that across for each row that it adds up to the number 12. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to create an input. Ion input. I'm going to have this placeholder. enter to do. Form, control, name. And set this to title. Let's go back to our page. So here we go. We can enter something here. But we also want a button. So this button, let's say Ion button, add. We'll set the color, set this to primary. If we go back, this is our button. If we inspect this, this is what it looks like. Cool. You can view this as an iOS application or Android. In the next video, we'll start worrying about actually submitting these to-dos. If we want to be able to submit these to-dos, we want to use our service. Let's go back to our application and take a look at to see if we have a method for submitting actual to-dos. We don't. So let's create. Let's call this submit form. And this is going to take in a value. There's title. And there's completed. This is a void function, so not going to worry about that. Let's do some form validation. For, and let's just say const key in this dot validate form dot controls. This may look familiar for you if you've done Angular before. Let's say if, and this if statement is going to be this dot validate form dot controls as own property, let's say key. Then this is what we're going to do. This dot validate form dot controls. We're going to get that key. We're going to mark it as dirty. This dot validate form dot controls. We'll get that key again. Update value and validity. Value dot completed equals false. This is going to be the object that we pass in. I'm going to do a console.log. Let's just say submitted. And I just want to see what value I'm submitting. And let's say this dot to do service dot create. I'm going to pass in that value. Then this dot to do service dot find all. Then I'll get this response. This dot to do's equals response dot data. Let's see what issues we have here. Let's write this one more time. This dot do service dot find all. I call the method, which is where I messed up. Then let's say this dot to do's equals, let's have a response. Response dot data. Awesome. Let's fix this. Cool. What other errors do I have? Format the document. Everything seems to be good. Let's go back to our HTML. Let's do a ng submit. Let's say submit form validate form dot value, and also ion button type equals submit. All right, awesome. There we go. We have our form. So let's test this out. Let's inspect. Let's go to network. I'll just refresh this. So I have the title and completed. I get the ID returned, and also I get all of my IDs. So in the next tutorial, what we'll be doing is creating a list of to-dos. And one thing that we want to do before we go is let's go back to this page and reset the form. This dot validate form dot reset. Save that. Go back here. example, and it reset. We have our to-dos. Awesome. First of all, let's talk about the finding to-dos. So we want to actually load these to-dos into our component, and we can do this by one, on the initial page load, which is ng on init, this dot to do service dot find all, call this method, then let's have our response. And say this dot to do to-dos equals response.data. Now on refresh, I want to do the same thing, but something slightly different. This dot to do service dot find all, then response. So what I'm going to do is this dot to-dos equals response.data, and then I'm also going to have event details complete. Cool. So pretty much what this does is when this is refreshed, the spinner stops. We can see this by every time I pull this down, I get to-dos. Awesome. So the next thing I want to do is start creating a to-dos component. Let's go to home and let's do to-do. Let's say we're going to have a to-do dot module dot ts file, to-do dot component dot ts, to-do dot component dot css, or let's actually just change that to scss, sass. And also the HTML file with us, to-do dot component dot HTML. So we'll save that, and then the next video we'll start actually placing some CSS in these files. So let's start digging into our CSS first. So we're going to use a lot of the same CSS that we have in messages. So we'll go here and just pretty much copy everything. We don't want to reinvent the wheel per se. So let's go here and we'll look at a lot of different things. So we have the padding start, basic margin for our labels, our H2 elements, and a lot of different other components. So you can go over this yourself, but we won't explain everything because it's expected that you know CSS. Now, there are a few things that we will add. So let's say I will have a toggle, and we'll talk about this later, but ion toggle, which is like a switch, And I'll set the margin dot right. I'll set this to 15 pixels. And I'll also have another button that we'll be using. And I'll set the margin right to 10 pixels. And I'm also going to have a class called completed. And text decoration line through. All right, awesome. So we're done with our CSS. We're not going to touch it again. Let's go into our modules. So if we go back to our modules file, we'll have a basic module. So let's say this. I'm going to do ng module. I'm going to do my imports. Common module. Forms module. Ionic module. And our router module. Next, I'll have declarations. Let's say to do component. I haven't created this yet, so let's actually not do that. Let's actually go back and create the to do component first, so we don't have to worry about that. We get that out of the way. So let's go to our to do component file, and we're going to create a new component. Let's do at component selector. Let's say app to do, and the template URL we'll have that as to do dot component dot HTML and we'll have the styles URL to do dot component dot, and this is the SCSS file. Let's do an export class to do component implements on init. ng on init. All right. So let's see if there's anything else that we should think about. Let's do is iOS. This is just a function to see if the component is being ran on iOS. Const. Let's do window equals window as any. And we'll return window All right. Awesome. Let's go back to our module. And let's go to exports to do component, export class to do component module. All right. And the next tutorial will be actually building out this to do component and also placing data inside of it. Before we actually build out our to-do component, let's actually jump back to our home page and add a few methods that allow for us to delete and update to-dos. So if we jump back here, we're going to create a couple methods, and let's say update to-do, and we'll do const updated to-do equals object dot assign. As you guys know, object assign creates a copy of the object. That way we're not modifying the object directly. And updated to do dot completed equals updated to do dot completed, the opposite of that. So if it's false, it becomes true. If it's true, it becomes false. Console.log to do updated. So now what we're going to do is this dot to do service dot update. We're going to pass in the updated to do. Then we're going to do to do for this dot to do service dot find all. Then this dot to do's equals, and make sure that we have our response. Response dot data. Let's create a delete method as well. Let's pass in a to do. And let's say console.log delete. Let's have this to do. Let's say this dot to do service dot delete. We'll pass in the to do dot ID. Then we'll run this dot to do service dot find all. And as you already know, then have the arrow function, this dot to do's equals the response dot data. So those are just some data points that we needed added first. Now the reason why we created these is to pass these functions down directly into our to-do component. We're going to need these for later. Now if we head on back to our to-do component, and let's make sure that there's no errors. Let's head on back to our to-do component, and let's say this. We're going to have inputs at input to do then at input update and at input delete awesome. So we have our to-do component, our TypeScript. The next thing we'll want to do is actually start building our HTML, and we'll do that in the next video. Let's head on back to our to-do HTML file, so our to-do component.html, and what we're going to do is create an Ionic item. And let's go over this in the documentation. So pretty much this is an element that can contain text and icons and so on, and they're typically in a list. So we're going to be creating this item, and we're going to do an ng if and so if there's a to-do, we're going to display this item. We're going to have the detail equal false. Now inside of this item, let's have a div. Inside of this div, let's have the slot equals start and a class. Now this class is going to change depending on the properties of this to-do. So to-do.completed Awesome. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to have a label. Ion label. And here, let's say class equals ion text ref. We're going to have h2. This h2 is going to contain our to-do.title. We're also going to have another class. And let's say to-do.completed. Uncompleted. And completed. Now, one more thing that we want is to say H3. To-do.completed. We'll say it's active. Otherwise, it's completed. That's enough for our label. And we'll also have a toggle. So ion toggle. Now we will have ng model. And disabled equals false. Now, when we click this, we're going to fire a function. So let's say click. Updated to do. Actually, it's supposed to be update. And also, on the next line, we'll also create a delete button. So ion button. So let's set this color to danger. And also, when we click this, we'll run the delete method as well. To do. Let's save this. Now let's go back and go over this. So we have our to-do that we can use inside of our component. We have update and delete methods. And one last thing we'll want to do is go to our home component. And let's see here. In our home component, we will want to find a way to list this instead of messages. So think about how would we do this. We would go to the module file and say to do component module. Now, all we have to do is go to this page. Now let's get rid of app message. if we think about how would we do this, we would be creating a list. So let's delete this and say app to do. And what we're going to want to do is add some of these attributes. So ng4 equals let to do of to-dos Then let's say we pass that to do equals to do. We have the delete method. This dot delete and update. This dot update. So if we go back here, and let's say, what issues did we run into? Cannot bind ng4 to and there we go. So now we're seeing, why is this button appearing like this? Because we don't have anything inside of the button. So first, we need to go back to our to-do file, HTML, and add an X. Now if we go back here, this is our component. If we update it, then this happens. Add something else, that happens. And if we want to delete it, then it can now be deleted. Awesome. So we now have our to-do application. And there we go.